Now,
Hi.
I'm happy to welcome Teaching for Black Lives co-editor Jesse Hagopian. He is an editor for Rethinking Schools and campaign director for Zinn Education's project. He joins us today to discuss his latest book. Look at it. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. Teach Truth, the struggle for anti-racist education and the campaign to fight back against bans on books and education. Jesse, I'm so
Sierra,
excited.
I'm so excited for this conversation, and I don't think I've ever had a better introduction. I really appreciate not just this conversation tonight, but all the work that we've got to do together and all the play and just hanging out as well. And I look forward to many more years in the struggle with you. So thank you so much, Sierra.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Now, speaking of you being one of my favorite storytellers, you begin with a book with a personal and a powerful narrative about your family's discovery about your ancestors. So, can you share a bit more with us about your family's story and how does it shape your commitment to education and being a truth teacher?
Yes. Thank you for starting the conversation out with my ancestors because that's really how I start the book off. In fact, I thought I'd just read folks the dedication because I wrote in the dedication, "For my ancestors. Writing this book has allowed me to delve into the portal of history and draw nearer to you. I am grateful to be closer to you now than ever before and grateful for all you have taught me. No one has the right to tear us apart by erasing your legacy. My supreme aspiration is to guard your memory and make you proud." And, as I began writing this book in the summer of 2021, my dad made a stunning discovery. He found out which plantation our family had been enslaved on. And I opened the book with the story of my family's journey to discover the plantation in Mississippi where our ancestors were enslaved. And, that journey was delayed multiple times by COVID and, long COVID, my dad's stroke. But we eventually stood on the land where our ancestors toiled under unspeakable conditions. And I was there at the burial ground for our enslaved ancestors. And I wrote a letter to them that we read aloud as part of our ceremony to honor our ancestors. So I thought I'd just read the very end of that letter. Um, that I read aloud at the burial site. And I conclude the letter to my ancestors saying, "We are here to experience a truth deeper than any that can be understood intellectually. We are here to make a promise to you, to this land, and to each other. You will not be forgotten. It doesn't matter if they pass laws that make it illegal to speak of you, teach about you, or learn about you, because those laws don't govern us. Only truth and love govern us. And so we will pass on the knowledge of this land and your existence here to our posterity and to all who we encounter. We send to you our deepest gratitude for gifting us the will to survive and the spirit of resistance that you passed on to us through your blood and through your stories. With eternal love, Jesse, Jamana, and Gerald, my dad." And after reading that letter, we knelt on the ground to be closer to our ancestors. And it was just one of the most important moments in my life, and I think something that will sustain me until my last breath in pursuing that promise to my ancestors to teach the truth. And, I see teaching the truth about my ancestors as both an act of remembrance and an act of rebellion against a system that would rather have us forget what happened in this country.
Ooh, yes. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your words directly from the book. It's just so moving to hear your story, your experience, and to be on that land and to reclaim those stories and to be able to pass those stories on. Wow. Now, you talked about it being an act of rebellion because right now in 44 states and counting, legislation has either been introduced or passed that denies educators from teaching the truth about history, creating a chilling effect, and the termination and doxing of a lot of teachers, which you interviewed in your book. And so, what are some of the root causes of the attacks on education that we are experiencing now? And why is the right latching on to the term critical race theory?
Yes, they certainly are, aren't they? The right has latched onto critical race theory as this catch-all term to weaponize it against really, I think, everything they fear, right? And this is part of what I describe in the book as post-truth schooling, right? This is an effort to rewrite history, to justify the current inequalities that exist. And the attacks on education are really just so over the top, so absurd today that I think only really the Onion can capture uh, what's going on in society right now. If people remember the Onion headline that ran above the picture of a black teacher, it said, "Teacher fired for breaking state's critical race theory laws after telling students she was black." Right? It's like as ridiculous as the Onion headline is, the reality of the laws that are being passed are more ridiculous. You have to uh, consider the laws in Florida, right? The current law in Florida, Florida's official state curriculum declares that slavery was of, quote, personal benefit to black people. For real. Right? This isn't in the Ku Klux Klan's youth handbook. This is in the state mandated curriculum that calls slavery of personal benefit to black people, right? They banned AP African American Studies class, and it is now a felony in Florida if you get caught with a banned book in your classroom. You can go to jail for 5 years if you get caught with a book that tells the truth about Black history or about gender identity. And the problem isn't just in the South or in red states, right? I mean, many of you educators here today know this, that in New Hampshire, they proposed making educators sign a loyalty oath similar to the one that they made educators sign during the Red Scare. These anti-truth laws have passed in Idaho and Montana and Iowa. And it's not just the statewide bans. We know that, like in California, these bills have been passed in at least 7 districts. So in the state of California, over 110,000 students go to a school where it's illegal to teach the truth, right? And we're now in a situation where almost half of all public school children across the country today are subjected to laws that require educators to lie to their students about systemic racism, and many laws that also require dishonesty about gender identity and sexuality. And in the book, I call these laws truth crime laws because they criminalize educators' ability to teach honestly about history. And these truth crime laws are really grounded in fear. And I call the people that perpetuate these laws, I call them in the book uncritical race theorists, right? And today the conversation about critical race theory is ubiquitous, but I think what's not really discussed and what needs to be at the center of the debate about education is uncritical race theory, right? This is the set of ideas that unquestioningly reinforce existing racial power relations, unequal power relations, right? In uncritical race theory, systems of ideas that deny that racism exists at all or maintains that racism primarily victimizes white people, or rejects any idea of systemic racism, right? Instead, for ideas around individual bias, right? And so uncritical race theorists position themselves as neutral and objective and just natural ideas, but in fact, they have a highly developed idea of race, and they have uh, tried to politicize the classroom uh, to an extreme extent. And one of the best examples of uncritical race theory I could give you comes from our president-elect, who was in a speech in June 2024 at the Faith and Freedom Coalition. He was criticizing proposals to change names of schools. I wonder if people saw this speech. And he said, quote, "How about George Washington High School? We want the name removed from that school, but they don't know why. You know, they thought he had slaves. Actually, I think he probably didn't." And there you have it, the greatest example of uncritical race theory, right? They would just rather lie to youth about American history than confront the uncomfortable truth, the cotton picking truth that George Washington owned 123 enslaved black people and added 153 more enslaved black people through marriage, right? Trump believes that dishonesty about US history is essential because if students understood this country's foundation in genocide and in enslavement, they might question today's unequal distribution of power. So that's why when I teach George Washington, I don't just teach about his policies and his power. I also teach from the perspective of Ona Judge, who was an enslaved black woman who bravely escaped his forced labor camp, right? And I want my kids to think critically about US history. I want them to refuse to exclude the role of race in U.S. history as part of that inquiry. And so, in the book, I trace the history of uncritical race theory thought, and truth crime laws from the first anti-literacy law in South Carolina in 1740, banning black people's right to read and write, all the way up through today's attack on critical race theory. And uh, I hope people will dig into that to see that people like Trump and Christopher Rufo, their legacy is one of the anti-literacy laws, the attacks on black education all through history. And our legacy is one of those who built the pit schools and the hush harbors, secretly, clandestinely educating black people about their history uh, in order to resist. I'll just end by saying that I think that we have to build a new movement for racial justice that not only uplifts the popular slogan of the Black Lives Matter movement that says legalize being black. We definitely have to fight for that, but to achieve that, I think we also have to couple that demand with the demand to legalize black history if black lives are ever to be truly valued.
Yes. Wow. I have my legalized Black History shirt on for Jesse today.
Yeah.
Perfect segue. But I just for everyone who's listening in, I highly recommend diving into the Teach Truth book because Jesse just catalogs this history so thoughtfully and strategically and weaving so many historical moments together that when you read it, I mean, my mind was just blown of the connections and the history that they're trying to ban to make it so that we can't learn that history and make connections to today. And Jesse, you make connections not only between what's happened historically and what's happening right now, but also between the attacks on teaching the truth about racism, the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, and the backlash that a lot of educators are experiencing when teaching about Palestine and Israel. So can you share the connections between these struggles for justice and why uncritical race theorists are attempting to police students and teachers?
Yes. Yeah, I love that we're having this conversation. It's amazing after all these years of us interviewing everyone that we get to dive into it. And I just really thank you for the close read you did of the book and the opportunity to share some of these connections because I think all these attacks share a common playbook, the playbook of divide and conquer, the playbook of McCarthyism. And whether it's banning books on race or silencing LGBTQ plus voices or suppressing critiques of Israel's policies, I think the goal remains the same, to pit people against each other, to suppress marginalized voices, and to preserve the current power system. And teaching about the intersections of race, class, gender, imperialism, I think this really threatens their agenda because it equips students with the tools to recognize and challenge oppression. So they claim that critical race theory is divisive, but I think what's divisive is racism, is xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. Those are the tactics of divide and conquer. And today's uncritical race theorists are just recycling strategies from the McCarthy era. They're borrowing from the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare to attack honest educators and movements for social justice. Because during the Red Scare, teachers who encouraged students to question inequality were labeled as communists and they were fired by the thousands all over the country, right? As I said, they had to sign loyalty oaths. There were book bans. Over 400 teachers in New York City alone were fired during the Red Scare. And the Lavender Scare had also devastating impact. I think even more um, people were fired from the federal government under suspicion of being homosexual than even were fired under suspicion of being communist. And this is what we're seeing. Fast forward to today, and the don't say gay laws, don't say trans laws are echoing the lavender scare bigotry that we saw in that era, right? And so I think um, the kind of uh, uh, red scare tactics are certainly being applied today to educators who are teaching the truth about the genocide being perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. And, many politicians, both Republican and Democrat, expressed more outrage over students protesting and camping out against the genocide than they did when Israel was bombing Palestinians in their tents in refugee camps, right? And these attacks they're not about protecting education. I think they're really about silencing solidarity, silencing movements for justice. And I'll just end here by saying, what really ended the McCarthy era, what broke through the paranoia and the hysteria of the Red Scare and Lavender Scare? It was the civil rights movement. It was the great resurgence of the Black freedom struggle that then gave birth to a students' rights movement and a women's rights movement and an anti-war movement that swept campuses to put an end to the murderous war in Vietnam, right? And this incredible struggle uh, freed people from the fear of being labeled communists to actually look at how are we going to build a society that is built around meeting human need and not just enriching the few. And they don't want us to learn that history because then we would begin using those lessons to build a new uprising to wipe away their lies today, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And we're actually going to talk more about that later on. We'll talk about the resistance to the truth crime laws. But one of the other things you talked about the silencing, one of the and the erasure. So I want to talk a little bit more about how in the book you talk about educational arson. So you're talking about erasure and violence as a means for uncritical race theorists to engage in this erasure of information and knowledge. So, what is the purpose of educational arson, and what are some historical and current examples of how that happens?
Yeah, yeah. The more I researched the history of Black education, the more I noticed this pattern of white supremacists using the flame, using gasoline, right? Actually physically burning books and schools and teachers that they disagreed with, right? And so I wanted to name that practice that's been happening throughout history. Uh, and so I call it educational arson. And it's connected to an interrelated idea of epistemicide, which is the destruction of ways and understanding the world that Boaventura de Sousa Santos developed, right? And so epistemicide is really about erasing ideas that don't conform to dominant colonial paradigms. And it's a form of intellectual violence that marginalizes alternative forms of knowledge, right? So educational arson is one tool that radical extremists of uncritical race theorists use to destroy systems of knowledge that challenge racism. And there's a lot of important examples. Uh, I'll give you a couple of them. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landa came into contact with the Mayan people in 1562. And, when he met the Mayans, we're talking about a culture that was like over 2,000 years old. And the Mayans had produced some of the most important advancements of any society on earth. They were probably the most sophisticated astronomers, mathematicians, agriculturalists, linguistics, like of any people on earth. And the Mayan books they wrote recorded their civilization, their religion, their scientific breakthroughs, their mathematical theories, and their history. And then on July 12th, 1562, Spanish educational arsonists, right, these conquistadors came and they burned every single Mayan text in existence in a giant conflagration, right? 4 books were found that were spared. There's 4 books left, but all of that history and knowledge was destroyed in a giant bonfire of epistemicide. And that's a tactic they've used over and over again throughout history. During Reconstruction, educational arsonists burnt down over 600 schools. These were Black schools, right? Black people were building the public school system. We have to know that Black people built the public school system in this country. There were public schools before Reconstruction in the North, but how public can we really call them when they didn't accept Black students, right? And in the South, there were no public schools. So it was Black people who built the public school system in this country. And the Ku Klux Klan found that to be a great threat to their power and used the flame and kerosene in their attack. And Also during the Reconstruction era, there was the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And this organization had as its emblem a book burning. That was its official seal. And it was headed by a man named Anthony Comstock. And if Anthony Comstock was alive today, he would just take delight in today's truth crime laws and today's educational closeting, what I call educational closeting, the ideas of the don't say gay laws, because Comstock passed a series of laws known as the Comstock laws, which were, in his mind, about eradicating obscenity, right? And here's his idea of obscenity. He wanted to ban um, Walt Whitman's poetry collections, Leaves of Grass. He wanted to ban anatomy textbooks because, after all, they show naked bodies. He wanted to ban anything that provided women information about contraception. And in 1934, Comstock Society oversaw the destruction of an estimated 15 tons of literature, over 476 books, over 11,000 magazines, and 100,000 pamphlets, right? And educational arson is still a tool they use today. There was a wave of arson attacks on Black churches in the 1990s that attacked Sunday schools. In 2016, it was a bomb threat on John Muir Elementary School in my hometown, my hometown of Seattle, that launched the Black Lives Matter at School movement to press back against those educational arsonists. You might remember Black History Month in 2022. There was a series of bomb threats against many historically Black colleges and universities across the US. And one of the most famous recent examples of educational arson came in September. I think it was September of 2023. And there, people may have seen this viral video uh, of Senator Bill Eigel, who was campaigning for governor, using a flamethrower to torch a stack of boxes at a fundraising event. And he said this about the video. He said, quote, "In the video, I am taking a flamethrower to cardboard boxes representing what I'm going to do to leftist policies and Rhino, Republican in name only, corruption of the Jeff City swamp. But let's be clear, if you bring those woke books to Missouri schools to brainwash our kids, I'll burn those too on the front lawn of the governor's mansion." And this is how outlandish the rhetoric has gotten from uncritical race theorists. And they don't burn books because they fear the past. They burn books because they fear the future that those books could inspire, right?
Wow. Yes. Those stories just and the connections that you're making is just mind-blowing to think about how this has shown up time and time again and still to this present day. Wow. And there's so many teachers who are in this space today, teacher educators, librarians, historians, community members who are already a part of this resistance. But Teach Truth and the Teach Truth movement really celebrates it also celebrates resistance. And so what are some examples of the resistance from what you share in the book?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the heart of this book. It are the stories of students and parents and caregivers, and especially educators at all levels and administrators who are fighting against these truth crime laws, who are courageously teaching the truth, even where it's illegal to do so. And you know, I also tell the story of the work of the Zinn Education Project and Black Lives Matter at School, the African American Policy Forum, and other groups like Heal Together. that are at the forefront of providing tools and frameworks for educators to fight back. And I want to tell the story of one particular educator who was fighting these truth crime laws. Um, do people remember the story of Summer Bossamer, a high school English teacher at Norman High School in Oklahoma? Her story was just really remarkable, and I tell it in the book because her administrators were really scared of what could happen under Oklahoma's new truth crime bill, which was HB 1775, and it restricted how race and identity could be taught and like which books you could read. And so they wanted teachers to get rid of all the books until they knew which ones were safe, right? And so um, what what Summer did was really innovative form of resistance. She covered up all the books in her classroom with red butcher paper, but she didn't stop there. She then took a black marker and wrote books the state doesn't want you to read in large letters across the butcher paper. And then she didn't stop there. She added, really a stroke of genius, she added a QR code that provided students a link to apply for the Brooklyn Public Library card, which would grant them access to any online book in their collection in any state. And then she added a note next to the QR code that said, definitely don't scan this, right? So there was no law stating that you couldn't tell students uh, to scan a QR code. There was no law that said you couldn't tell students definitely don't scan it. But nonetheless, the administrators put her on administrative leave. And the Oklahoma Secretary of Public Education, Ryan Walters, even sent a letter to the State Board of Education demanding that Summer be have her teaching certificate revoked, right? And then she just faced an onslaught of hate, right? She said that she was getting messages saying that she should be lynched or sterilized, just all kinds of hateful stuff. And like so many educators that I interviewed in this book, um, she just showed an incredible amount of courage to say, I refuse to lie to kids, and practice what Jarvis Givens calls fugitive pedagogy, right? So I interviewed Matthew Hahn, who was fired in Tennessee, and Amy Donofrio was fired in Florida. And I also interviewed who maybe we could call the protagonist of this book, James Whitfield, who was the black principal in Texas, who was pushed out um, when he sent an email out to his school community after George Floyd was killed, saying that systemic racism is alive and well. Um, So, I think one of the most important parts of this book is learning from the educators who have looked back at history, studied it, and are implementing it today. And so we tell the story of how the National Day of Action to Teach Truth was launched with the Zinn Education Project and Black Lives Matter at School. And, many thanks to Deborah Menkart, who has spent endless hours helping to organize this movement across the country, to Tamara Anderson from BLM at Schools. Julia Salcedo has put in so many hours. So many people behind the scenes have put in the work to coordinate this effort across the country, and it's resulted in some extraordinary forms of resistance. And one of my favorites has been the historical walking tours, right? They're not your ordinary protests, right? Because educators have found places in their community that reveal something about the Black freedom struggle or about systemic racism, and have gathered their community together to show them the history we're talking about is all around us, and we can't allow them to criminalize it, right? So in Michigan, the group organized a gathering at the very site on the train tracks where Malcolm X's dad was lynched, and then marched from that spot to the hospital where his dad ended up dying and gave out banned books to all the kids in that hospital, right? And they kept this history alive that way. In Seattle, we did walking tours to show where uh, the Black Panther Party clinic, free healthcare clinic, was started that still is in operation to this day, right? And many other places. So I'm excited to say that we're organizing, what is it, our fifth annual now? Teach Truth Day of Action on June 7th. There'll be rolling actions up to June 7th, but we will be supporting these actions across the country, and there's so much good information that we will be providing to folks for how they can participate.
Yes, I'm so in awe of all of the educators across the country who have publicly pledged and also done so in their classrooms to teach the truth regardless of the law, and to see how you are telling the story of the movement, especially at a time where they're trying to erase this history. So you're putting it in print to pass down, I think is so critically important that we have this resource to be able to share the story of the movement. So thank you. And speaking of resistance, the concept of the radical healing of organized remembering plays a central role in your book. So, what does this mean, and how can educators engage in it as an act of resistance?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I was reading a book by the critical pedagogue Henry Giroux, and this book was titled The Violence of Organized Forgetting. And he talks about how curricular violence is used to maintain racism and militarism and privatization and a lot of forms of oppression. And, I think the violence of organized forgetting is such an important framework for understanding the current attacks on education right now. But I also wanted to think about how we heal from that violence. And you know, someone I think both you and I both really love, Sierra, is Sean Ginwright. And Ginwright writes a lot about healing-centered education. And he developed this concept of radical healing, which he wrote, quote, "Radical healing refers to a process that builds the capacity of people to act upon their environment in ways that contribute to the well-being for the common good." And so, in this context, I think the radical healing of organized remembering is about identifying collective efforts in education, but also in social movements to uncover um, the historical lessons that they've purposefully concealed, right? The historical lessons that they are trying to hide from our kids, that they are trying to hide from social movements. Um, and I think recovering those historical lessons are really vital for recovering from historical trauma that many of us face, right? And they're also crucial to building healthy movements for social justice. And I think that trauma is not only inflicted by physical act of violence, but also by the erasure and distortion of history. And I just I'll just tell a quick story that I think really uh, I didn't have the language of the radical healing of organized remembering at this time, but I think it's a good example of what I mean, because when I started teaching at my alma mater, Garfield High School, back in 2010, I was given the AP US History course to teach. I gotta say, I was really nervous to teach that course because as a student at Garfield High School, I never took an AP class. I didn't think those classes were for me. Um, they didn't have black kids in those classes, and Uh, so I kind of felt like an imposter there, even as the teacher. Like I didn't really belong there. And a lot of white parents didn't think I did either, and were very uh, forthright about being concerned that I wouldn't be able to get their students prepared to pass the AP exam. And that was a really hard situation. And there was a lot of pressure to teach to the test. But that just isn't me. I couldn't do it. And um, I just went to the Zinn Education Project website and used almost every lesson I could find, because I wanted to engage the kids in collective discussions about history and how to use that history today. And so we did the abolitionist role play where students all are members of different abolitionist organizations, right? And they have to debate each other about which strategy works the best for fighting and ending slavery. We did role plays about the fight for women's right to vote, uh, simulations about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where all the youth are members of SNCC and they have to debate uh, what the best strategy is for the civil rights movement, right? We did all these interactive lesson plans about every social justice issue I could find. And in the end, the students did very well on the AP exam, even though we hadn't prioritized teaching to the test. But I told them later that that's not actually when they passed my test. It was the next year when the state legislature announced that they were going to cut billions of dollars from the education budget in the wake of the Great Recession. And our state constitution says that education is the quote, paramount duty of the state, meaning they have to fund education before they fund anything else. So a group of us in a group called the Social Equity Educators organized a plan to disrupt their budget cutting session. And we went to the state capitol with many thousands of other protesters, but we actually got into the House Ways and Means Committee meeting where they did the budget cutting session. And we mic checked the room and we read out the state constitution. We announced that it was their paramount duty to fund education. And we said that we were at the scene of a crime, that they weren't just committing any crime, they were breaking the highest law of the state. And so at that point, I asked them to come into my custody for a citizen's arrest. And I even like brought out some plastic handcuffs and dangled them in the air. And at that point, the police officer didn't agree with my interpretation of the law and ended up arresting me instead of the legislatures, if you can believe that. So I spent the evening in jail, but my students found out what had happened on the news. And then the next day, I came to school, and one of my students who was in that class, in my AP US history class, had organized a Facebook page called Free Mr. Hagopian. So he took credit for my release. Uh, but then the following day, in 24 hours, he changed the Facebook page from Free Mr. Hagopian to walk out against the budget cuts. And they organized a committee where they created a pamphlet that showed what the budget cuts were going to do to Garfield High School. They made signs and flyers, and over 500 students marched out of Garfield High School to City Hall and demanded an audience with the mayor. They got their picture in the New York Times. They organized a citywide coalition and then organized a citywide walkout of schools all across the city. And they just put immense pressure on the state. And only a few weeks later, the state Supreme Court ruled in their favor, saying that, yes, the state was in violation of school funding policy. And it was just this awesome victory for our movement. And to me, that really showed what the violence of organized forgetting was about, and also what the healing of organized remembering is about. Because these students had learned how to organize social movements in my class. They had learned the lessons of almost every great movement I could find, and then they applied it in the real world. That's what uncritical race theorists are scared of. They're not scared that we're shaming white children. They know we're not shaming white children. What they really fear is that we're empowering white children to be part of a multiracial uprising that will demand the schools and society that our children deserve.
Wow, I'm speechless. Mm. So since I'm speechless, I'm going to pull from something that you wrote because one of my favorite lines from your book is you write, honest educators are blues singers. They tell history like it is, and they know how to improvise to bring the class into harmony. And I think the story that you just shared exemplifies what it means to be an honest educator, especially at a time of so much backlash, of so much violent erasure, how there's still so much resistance, there's still joy, there's still creativity, there's still friendship and camaraderie and truth teaching. So, Jesse, thank you so much for teaching me, for teaching and sharing these stories with all of us. Y'all, you gotta get the book, Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Teaching.